Hey guys, tonight we are going to a place so cold that the air itself becomes your enemy. Where breathing without a scarf can blister your lungs, where your eyelashes freeze together in seconds, and where the mercury doesn't just drop, practically burrows into the earth and refuses to come back up. Tonight we are going to Yakutia, the coldest permanently inhabited region on the face of this planet, and we are going to find out what it actually means to survive at minus 71 degrees Celsius. That's not a typo. That's not a wind chill figure. That's the recorded air temperature in the town of Oymyakon, and you probably won't survive this. At least not without a very serious wardrobe upgrade and a complete rethinking of what the word cold means to you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this from somewhere warm, a heated bedroom, a cozy apartment, somewhere with functioning radiators, drop your location and local time in the comments. I genuinely love seeing where in the world people are listening from, tucked in and drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't arrive in Yakutia so much as you are deposited into it. The plane, and there will be a plane because roads to this part of the world are more suggestion than infrastructure, descends through a sky that looks normal enough from above. Clouds, maybe a little gray, maybe thinned out into those high wispy streaks that mean the air up here is very, very dry. Then the wheels touch down and the world changes. The cabin crew, who have been perfectly cheerful for the entire flight, go slightly quiet in that practiced way that flight attendants do when they don't want to alarm you, but also feel some professional obligation to honesty. Someone near the front peeks through the window, and you can hear the soft intake of breath. Outside, everything is white. Not the romantic, soft white of a Christmas card. This is a harder white, a white that has absorbed all the warmth out of the landscape and left only a kind of luminous nothing. The trees, the low stubby birches and larches that somehow continue to exist here, are coated in hoarfrost so thick they look like they've been dipped in plaster. The ground is iron. The sky, if you're arriving in the deep of winter, is a shade of pale blue that doesn't quite match any blue you've seen anywhere else. It's the blue of a world that has decided warmth is optional. The door of the plane opens, and the cold hits you before you've taken a single step. This is the first thing that surprises almost everyone who makes this journey. You expect to walk out into the cold, to gradually encounter it. Instead, it comes to you, comes through the gap in the door while you're still 5 rows back in your seat, and it finds your ears first, then your nose, then the backs of your hands where your gloves haven't quite reached. And this isn't even the worst Yakutia has to offer. On a relatively mild January afternoon, and by mild I mean perhaps minus 45, this is your welcome. Yakutia is the formal name most outsiders use, but the region's official designation is the Sakha Republic, and it occupies roughly 3 million square kilometers of northeastern Russia. To put that in perspective, it is larger than Argentina. It is larger than all of Western Europe combined. It is, by a very comfortable margin, the largest federal subject of any country on Earth. And yet fewer than 1 million people live here. In some districts, you can drive for 6 hours without passing a building. The land simply goes on and on and on, tundra giving way to taiga, taiga giving way to frozen river valleys, and those valleys eventually climbing into mountain ranges that have barely been mapped. The city of Yakutsk is the capital, and with around 300,000 people, it represents the most densely settled part of this vast republic. It also holds the somewhat dubious distinction of being the coldest major city on the planet. Not a village, not a research station, not a seasonal outpost. A city with universities and theaters and traffic and teenagers complaining about homework, all operating in conditions that most of the industrialized world would classify as a national emergency. The average January temperature in Yakutsk is around minus 40 degrees Celsius. The average. That means plenty of days go lower. You, in our imagined journey tonight, have arrived in January. You've done your research. You've watched the videos, read the forums, consulted the lists of what to pack. And yet standing here, shuffling toward the small terminal building, you are already recalibrating. The coat you brought, a serious coat, an expedition-grade coat that cost more than your first bicycle, suddenly feels optimistic. Your face, the parts of it exposed between your hat and your scarf, are reporting sensations that your brain isn't quite sure how to categorize. It's not pain exactly, not yet. It's more like pressure, like the cold has weight, and it is pressing against your skin from all directions simultaneously. This is the first lesson Yakutia teaches, and it teaches it immediately. Cold here is not an absence of heat. It is a presence. It has texture. It has intention, or at least it feels like it does, and your body responds to it the way it responds to things that are actively happening to you rather than things that are simply missing. The town of Oymyakon, roughly 900 kilometers from Yakutsk and accessible via a road that is technically called the Road of Bones, we'll come back to that name because it earns it, holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded at a permanently inhabited settlement. In February of 1933, a Soviet meteorologist named Sergei Abrachev recorded -67.7 degrees Celsius. Though historians still argue whether the true lowest figure was -67.7 or -71.2, depending on which measurement methodology you accept and which recording station you trust. Either number is so far outside the range of ordinary human experience that the debate feels a little academic. At both temperatures, your exhaled breath freezes before it disperses. At both temperatures, diesel fuel gels in the tank and must be kept warm by keeping vehicle engines running all day, all night, continuously. At both temperatures, if you were somehow transported there without warning, without preparation, without clothing, you would lose consciousness in under 4 minutes. The name Oymyakon, in the Yakut language, is often translated as something close to non-freezing water, a reference to a thermal spring nearby that stays liquid even through the worst winters, and which presumably seemed miraculous enough to name the whole settlement after. There's a certain dry humor to that, naming your town after the one thing that doesn't freeze when essentially everything else around it does. It's the geographical equivalent of calling your neighborhood the place where the radiator works. As you make your way through the small terminal and into Yakutsk proper, you notice the steam first. This is another thing no photograph quite prepares you for. The city exists inside a permanent cloud of its own making. Every vent, every exhaust pipe, every manhole cover with warmth beneath it, every doorway that opens and releases a puff of heated interior air. All of it produces vapor that freezes the instant it meets the outside atmosphere, creating this low, drifting fog of ice crystals that sits over the city like a visible exhalation. Locals call it the breath of the city, and on the very coldest days it can reduce visibility to a matter of meters. You are driven to your accommodation, and the driver, a broad-shouldered man in a fur-lined hat with ear flaps that he has left untied, dangling cheerfully, because he has been doing this his whole life and -45 is practically a spring afternoon to him, points out landmarks with the casual proprietary pride of someone showing you around a garden. That building there is the main theater. That one is a shopping center. That road leads down to the Lena River, which is frozen solid enough right now to drive a truck across, and in fact people do regularly because the river serves as a road in winter when the actual roads become too dangerous. There is a particular quality to the light in Yakutia in deep winter that deserves its own paragraph. In December and January, you get perhaps 3 hours of actual daylight, not bright daylight, not high sun midday light, but a kind of extended blue-gray dusk that arrives around 10 in the morning, peaks at something approaching pale noon, and then retreats by 2 in the afternoon. The rest is dark, a clear, star-filled dark on good nights, or a black overcast nothing on cloudy ones. People who visit for the first time consistently report that the darkness is one of the harder things to adjust to. Not the cold you can dress against, you can technologically address. But the darkness gets inside your head in ways that no amount of layering can fix. And yet people live here. Not temporarily, not seasonally, not in rotating research teams who get to go home to somewhere reasonable after 6 months. People are born here, grow up here, raise families here, grow old here. The Saka people, the indigenous group most associated with this land, have been doing so for somewhere between 300 and 800 years, depending on which migration theory and which strand of oral history and archaeological evidence you find most convincing. They built a culture, an economy, a language, a cuisine, a spiritual relationship with the landscape, all calibrated to a world that sits at temperatures most of humanity will never experience. Your hotel room is warm. Aggressively, almost embarrassingly warm. This is another Yakutia constant. Interior spaces tend to be kept at temperatures that feel almost tropical in contrast to what's outside. The differential between outdoors and indoors can be 60, 70, even 80 degrees Celsius across a distance of a few centimeters of wall. Windows are triple or quadruple glazed, with sealed air gaps between each layer. Doors have double entries, a small vestibule between the exterior and interior doors, a pressure lock against the cold. You peel off your layers in stages, like an explorer emerging from a spacesuit, and you notice that even your innermost layer is slightly damp. Your body has been working hard just to stay warm during the 4 minutes between the airport vehicle and this building. For minutes, you sit on the edge of the bed, and the warmth of the room wraps around you like something physical. Outside, the temperature is falling further as the evening comes. The city breathes its frozen breath. The trees stand coated in their plaster-white frost. Somewhere out on the road toward Oymyakon, a truck is keeping its engine running through the night because the driver knows that if it stops, it won't start again until spring. And in that knowledge, in the simple, staggering fact of people having figured out how to exist in this place, how to not merely endure it but build something lasting inside it, there is something that pulls at you even through the warmth of your hotel room. You are in the coldest inhabited place on Earth, and the first thing it has made you feel underneath the physical shock of the temperature is a very deep and quiet kind of awe. The cold outside your window is not simply a number on a thermometer. It is a set of physical laws expressing themselves with unusual clarity, and your body, that warm, soft, biochemically complicated machine that evolved on the savannas of East Africa and never quite got the memo about Siberia, is about to have all of its assumptions tested simultaneously. Let's talk about what minus 71 degrees Celsius actually does, because understanding the science of this cold is the difference between finding it fascinating and finding it fatal. And tonight, from the safety of your warm bed, you get to do the former. Start with the basics. Temperature, at its most fundamental, is a measure of how fast molecules are moving. Heat is molecular motion, the frantic, constant vibration and collision of atoms in a substance. Cold is the slowing of that motion. At minus 71 Celsius, which is minus 96 Fahrenheit for those of you working in the older system, molecular motion in most substances has slowed to a degree that fundamentally changes how those substances behave. Liquids become solids. Gases thicken. Metals that are normally ductile become brittle. Rubber cracks. Plastics shatter. The physical world reorganizes itself around a new and harsher set of rules, and biology, your biology, is not exempt. The human body maintains a core temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius. This is not negotiable. Within a range of perhaps 4 degrees either side of that figure, your organs continue to function normally. Drop below 33 degrees, and you enter mild hypothermia. Shivering intensifies, judgment clouds, fine motor skills begin to deteriorate. Below 30 degrees, the shivering paradoxically stops, because your muscles no longer have the energy to sustain it. Your heart slows. Your breathing becomes shallow. Below 28 degrees, you are at serious risk of cardiac arrest. And this cascade, this slide from functional to fatal, can begin surprisingly quickly in extreme cold. The body is generating heat constantly through metabolism, through muscle activity, through the simple ongoing work of being alive. But at minus 71, the environment is extracting that heat faster than almost any biological system can replace it. Wind makes everything worse, and this is where the concept of wind chill earns its importance. Yakutia, thankfully, tends toward low wind speeds in its coldest periods. The same atmospheric conditions that allow temperatures to plummet to record lows also tend to be still, high-pressure systems where the air barely moves. This is not mercy exactly, but it is a feature. A wind of even 20 kilometers per hour at minus 45 degrees produces an effective temperature, in terms of heat loss from exposed skin, equivalent to something closer to minus 60. In still air, exposed skin can survive perhaps 10 minutes before frostbite begins. Add wind, and that window shrinks to 2 or 3 minutes. The residents of Yakutia are not unaware of this physics. On particularly still, particularly cold days, people sometimes describe the conditions as almost tolerable compared to a windy minus 30. Almost. Frostbite is the cold's most visible local damage, and it works through a mechanism that is worth understanding because it is not, as many people imagine, simply the freezing of skin. The body's first response to extreme cold is vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels near the surface of the skin, pulling warm blood away from the extremities and toward the core to protect the vital organs. This is intelligent design in the evolutionary sense. Your body is triaging itself, deciding that your fingers are less important than your heart. But the consequence of vasoconstriction in extreme cold is that those extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears, cheeks, lose their blood supply and, with it, their warmth. The tissue temperature in unprotected fingers can drop below 0 Celsius within minutes. Ice crystals form between the cells. Those crystals are mechanically destructive. They puncture cell membranes, disrupt tissue structure. When the tissue eventually rewarms, the cellular damage becomes apparent. In mild cases, blistering and peeling. In severe cases, gangrene and amputation. What makes Yakutia particularly interesting from a physiological standpoint is the question of what prolonged generational exposure to this cold has done to the people who live there. This is an area of ongoing research and no small amount of scholarly debate. Historians and anthropologists still argue whether the Saka people and other groups native to this region have developed genuine physiological adaptations to cold, or whether their survival represents purely cultural and technological innovation. Some studies have suggested differences in basal metabolic rates, in the distribution of brown adipose tissue, that's the metabolically active fat that generates heat rather than simply storing it, and in peripheral circulation patterns. Other researchers argue the evidence for genetic adaptation is thin, and that the real story is one of extraordinary learned knowledge rather than altered biology. What is clear is that newcomers to Yakutia undergo measurable physiological changes relatively quickly. The body acclimates, not to the point of comfort, nothing so dramatic, but in ways that are detectable. Resting metabolic rate increases. Circulation to the extremities improves somewhat relative to the initial exposure. People who have spent years in the region report that temperatures which were physically shocking in their first winter begin to feel merely unpleasant by their third or fourth. The cold remains objectively dangerous. It simply becomes a known danger rather than a surprise one. Your breath is one of the cold's most immediate effects, and it produces one of Yakutia's most distinctive sensory experiences. When you exhale at -40 or below, the water vapor in your breath freezes almost instantly, producing a fine mist of ice crystals that falls rather than disperses. Locals call this the whisper of the stars, a phrase that sounds poetic until you realize it refers to the faint hissing sound that falling ice crystals make in very still, very cold air. The Russian term, more prosaically, is the breath crackling, and it is used as a rough field guide to temperature. When you can hear your own breath crackling as it freezes, you know you are somewhere below -50. It is a natural thermometer and a slightly unsettling one. Metal behaves extraordinarily badly in these temperatures, and this creates practical challenges that cascade through every aspect of life in Yakutia. Steel becomes brittle below approximately -30, losing the ductile flexibility that makes it useful in construction and machinery. Bolts shear, axles snap. Bridge components that flex harmlessly in temperate climates crack under the combination of load and cold-induced brittleness. The engineering solutions required are elaborate, special cold-resistant steel alloys, heating elements embedded in critical components, designs that account for thermal contraction on a scale that would be irrelevant anywhere else. A steel beam that contracts perfectly predictably at -10 behaves quite differently at -60, and the difference matters enormously when that beam is holding up a building or a bridge. Rubber seals, the unsung heroes of virtually every mechanical system. In car doors, in pipelines, in aircraft, in anything that needs to not leak, become completely useless at Yakutia's extreme temperatures. Standard rubber transitions from flexible to rigid to shattered in a progression that happens faster than most engineering specifications account for. Silicone-based seals work somewhat better, and the engineering community in this region has developed extensive practical knowledge about material selection that represents a genuinely specialized body of knowledge. A quirky footnote here: during the height of the Soviet space program, engineers working on components that needed to function in the thermal extremes of space reportedly consulted with Yakutian industrial engineers, because the experience base for material behavior at extreme cold existed there in a way it didn't exist anywhere else in the country. Diesel fuel gels at approximately -20°C and stops flowing through fuel lines. Petrol fares somewhat better but still becomes sluggish. The practical consequence in Yakutia is that vehicles must be kept running, not left to cool and restart, but continuously running throughout the winter if they are to remain functional. Parking lots across Yakutsk have electrical outlets alongside each space, allowing vehicles to be plugged into engine block heaters that keep the oil and coolant from solidifying overnight. In areas without this infrastructure, drivers simply don't turn their engines off for months at a time. The fuel cost is significant. The alternative is a vehicle that will not start until May. Batteries, which depend on chemical reactions that slow dramatically in cold, also become unreliable. The lithium-ion batteries that power modern smartphones and laptops lose a significant fraction of their capacity below freezing, and at -40 they may simply refuse to function at all. This is a source of considerable inconvenience for visitors and a practical reality that locals have long since adapted to. Phones are kept in inner pockets, against the body, until the moment they're needed. Newcomers learn this lesson usually within the first day, when they attempt to photograph the remarkable landscape and discover their phone has died in the 2 minutes since they last checked it. Electronic components more broadly are vulnerable. Solder joints, the tiny connections between components on circuit boards, can crack under repeated thermal cycling, the expansion and contraction of materials as they move between the warmth of an interior and the cold of the exterior. Screens crack. LCD displays freeze and go black. Aviation presents particular challenges. Aircraft parked overnight in Yakutsk must be hangared or fitted with external heating systems, and the pre-flight procedures involve checks and warm-up sequences that would seem excessive anywhere else. Water, which freezes at 0°C, obviously presents challenges across every scale in Yakutia. Pipes that carry water must be either buried deeply below the permafrost's active layer, or insulated and heated continuously, or both. The active layer, the surface layer of soil that thaws briefly in summer and refreezes each winter, creates particular engineering difficulties because it moves, slightly but consequentially, with each cycle. Pipes that are not properly accommodated to this movement crack. The city of Yakutsk has an elaborate system of above-ground insulated pipes running between buildings on raised supports, a distinctive visual feature of the cityscape that looks to outsiders like some kind of experimental architecture and is in fact simply the most pragmatic solution to a physics problem. One of the stranger phenomena at extreme cold is the behavior of light itself. Not the light, technically, but the atmosphere through which it travels. At very low temperatures, the air near the ground becomes so much denser and colder than the air above it that light refracts in unusual ways, creating optical effects that have startled and confused travelers throughout history. Pillars of light appear to rise from street lamps. The sun, when it appears, may seem larger and more distorted than usual, or may be accompanied by sundogs, bright spots of refracted light on either side of the solar disk. Halos form around the moon. The whole visual environment becomes slightly unreal, a landscape rendered not quite correctly, as if someone has adjusted the settings on the world. There is, sitting underneath all of this physics and physiology, a question that researchers are still actively working through. Why does Yakutia get this cold? The answer involves geography, atmospheric dynamics, and a particular set of interacting factors that create a kind of perfect storm of cold. The region sits at high latitude, obviously, which means low solar input in winter. But other places at similar latitudes, coastal Alaska, northern Scandinavia, do not reach these temperatures. The difference is Yakutia's extreme continental position. It is as far as possible from any ocean, which means no maritime moderating influence, no flow of relatively warm, moisture-laden air off the sea. The landscape is also a broad basin, flanked by mountain ranges that trap cold, dense air and prevent it from circulating away. In winter, under clear skies with strong radiative cooling, the process by which the surface loses heat rapidly into the cold, clear sky. Temperatures in these valley basins plunge in ways that more exposed or coastal locations simply don't. Add minimal snowfall to insulate the ground, and you have a landscape that just keeps getting colder night after night through the darkest part of winter, until a number like -71 becomes not just possible but perhaps inevitable. You lie in your warm hotel room, and outside that record cold is pursuing its ordinary nightly business, slowly extracting heat from every surface, every substance, every living thing that hasn't found adequate shelter. The physics is relentless and impersonal. It does not care that you are warm and comfortable in here. It simply continues, patient and thorough, as it has for millennia. And the remarkable thing, the thing that will carry us through the rest of tonight's story, is that humans found ways not just to survive it but to build something recognizably human inside it. The Saka people did not stumble into Yakutia by accident. They arrived, over a period of centuries, through a migration that represents one of the more audacious territorial expansions in the history of human settlement. Moving not toward warmth and abundance, as most migration narratives tend to go, but deeper and deeper into cold, into isolation, into a landscape that offered extraordinary difficulty in exchange for something harder to name. Space, perhaps. Freedom from the pressures of more crowded southern lands. Or simply the momentum of movement, one generation pushing slightly further than the last until the pushing stopped and the building began. Whatever the reason, they arrived and they stayed, and what they built in response to this environment is one of the most sophisticated cold-weather cultures the world has ever produced. The origins of the Saka are traced by most historians to the Lake Baikal region, far to the south, a warmer, more hospitable landscape of forests and grasslands where a Turkic-speaking people herded horses and cattle and lived a life that, while not easy by any modern standard, was at least conducted at temperatures that didn't freeze your exhalation before it dispersed. The migration northward is dated to roughly the 13th and 14th centuries, though some scholars push elements of it earlier, and the causes are debated in the way that all ancient migrations are debated, with reference to climate shifts, pressure from neighboring groups, political disruption, and the inevitable uncertainty that comes from reconstructing events through archaeology and oral tradition rather than written record. What the Saka brought with them, crucially, was the horse, not as a luxury or a symbol of status, but as a survival tool, as a food source, as a partner in the enterprise of living somewhere that had no interest in making things easy. The Yakutian horse, and this is one of those animals that deserves its own documentary, frankly, is a breed unlike any other equine on the planet. Short, stocky, heavily muscled, covered in a coat of fur rather than hair, with a mane that grows thick enough in winter to be almost comical. This horse can survive Yakutian winters outdoors, without shelter, without supplemental feeding, by pawing through snow to reach the frozen grass beneath. Historians still argue whether this breed represents a pre-existing local adaptation, or whether the horses brought by the Saka migrants adapted over subsequent centuries to the conditions they found themselves in. The genetic picture is complicated, with research suggesting deep ancient lineage alongside more recent Mongolian input. Either way, the result is an animal that does something no other domestic horse breed does. It willingly lives in -50 and considers this normal. The fat content of Yakutian horse meat is exceptionally high, an adaptation that also makes it an extraordinarily calorie-dense food source for the people who depend on it. The Saka also brought cattle, which similarly adapted over generations into a distinctive local breed. The Yakutian cattle, smaller than their southern relatives, covered in a dense double-layered coat, able to extract nutrition from the minimal forage available under deep snow. These animals represent a genetic resource of considerable interest to modern researchers working on cold hardiness. And there have been serious conservation efforts focused on maintaining pure Yakutian cattle breeds as the region's agricultural economy has modernized. A quirky footnote: Yakutian cattle milk has a significantly higher fat content than milk from temperate breeds. The cold demands calories, and the biology of these animals has responded accordingly. The Saka's relationship with horses runs deeper than utility, deeper than food and transport. In the traditional spiritual framework of the Saka, their indigenous belief system, sometimes called Tengriism but carrying specifically Yakutian characteristics, the horse is a sacred animal, associated with the upper world and with warmth and light. The Great Spring Festival, Isiak, which celebrates the return of warmth after the winter darkness, and remains the most important cultural celebration in Yakutia to this day, centers on the ritual fermentation and communal drinking of kumis, fermented mare's milk, as an act of spiritual renewal and community connection. Isiak is held in late June, when the sun barely sets, when the temperature has climbed back into positive figures, and the whole traumatized landscape erupts into a brief, almost frantic greenness. It is a celebration with the emotional intensity that makes complete sense when you understand what it is celebrating the survival of. The spiritual life of the Saka is mediated by a figure central to their traditional culture, the Oyun, or shaman. Shamanic practice in Yakutia has been documented by outsiders since Russian expansion into the region in the 17th century, and those early accounts, written by Cossack administrators, by Orthodox missionaries, by travelers and traders, reflect a mixture of fascination, condescension, and genuine bewilderment at a spiritual system that didn't map onto anything the observers had encountered before. The Oyun was understood, within the Saka cosmological framework, as an intermediary between the human world and the layered spirit worlds above and below it, able to journey, in states of ritual trance, into realms inaccessible to ordinary people, to negotiate with spirits on behalf of the living, to seek the causes of illness and misfortune in the invisible landscape that ran parallel to the visible one. The regalia of the Oyun, the elaborate ritual costume hung with iron pendants, mirrors, and symbolic attachments, was understood not as decoration but as armor and equipment for these spirit journeys. Each element had a specific function in the cosmological architecture that the shaman navigated. The Russian Orthodox Church, arriving with the Cossack expansion, made considerable efforts to suppress shamanic practice, with incomplete success over several centuries. The Soviet period was far more aggressive. Shamanism was classified as superstition and actively persecuted, shamans were imprisoned or killed, and the transmission of shamanic knowledge across generations was disrupted in ways that are still being reckoned with. And yet the practice survived, underground and fragmented, and in the post-Soviet period has experienced something of a revival, both as genuine spiritual practice and as a marker of cultural identity for a people working through questions of what it means to be Saka in a modern Russia. The language the Saka brought with them and developed in isolation is itself a record of their environmental adaptation. Yakut, as the language is sometimes called by outsiders, belongs to the Turkic family, distantly related to Turkish, Uzbek, Kazakh, but has developed in isolation for long enough that it has diverged substantially, absorbing influences from Mongolian and from the Tungusic languages of neighboring peoples, and producing a lexical richness around cold, snow, ice, and winter conditions that reflects centuries of very close attention to these phenomena. There are words in Yakut for specific types of snow: fresh snow, crusted snow, granular snow, snow with a layer of ice over it from a freeze-thaw cycle, snow that is good for traveling by sled versus snow that will exhaust the dogs. There are words for different qualities of cold: still cold versus windy cold, the cold that precedes a weather change versus the stable cold of a settled high-pressure system. This isn't merely linguistic curiosity. It represents an accumulated vocabulary of survival, where precision in describing conditions could be the difference between a successful journey and a fatal one. The traditional dwelling of the Saka is called the balagan, a log structure built with a distinctive outward slanting wall design, lower at the base than at the top, which distributes the weight of snow loads and provides better insulation than a vertical wall by trapping more air in the construction. The balagan was oriented with its entrance facing east, toward the sunrise, a spiritual orientation that also had the practical benefit of minimizing exposure to the prevailing westerly winds. Interior spaces were organized around a central hearth, and the social geography of the interior, who sat where, which direction was associated with which spiritual significance, was elaborately codified. The ceiling was low, deliberately so, to keep the heated air as concentrated as possible around the living space. Floors were earthen, and the cold of the permafrost below was addressed with layers of animal skins and whatever insulating material was available. The relationship between the Saka and the other peoples of Yakutia is a complex social geography that is worth at least briefly acknowledging. The Saka were and are the dominant group, but they share the republic with Evenki, Evens, Yukagir, Chukchi, and other indigenous peoples whose histories in the region predate even the Saka migration and whose own adaptations to the cold represent equally sophisticated bodies of knowledge. The reindeer-herding cultures of the northern tundra Evenki, and Evens in particular, developed survival strategies calibrated to a different ecological zone than the Saka's horse and cattle culture, following the reindeer through their seasonal migrations, moving with the landscape rather than settling into it. relations between these groups, and between all of them and the arriving Russians from the 17th century onward, have been complex, shifting, sometimes violent, sometimes collaborative, a social history that is still being written and that the modern Sakha Republic navigates as an administrative entity within the Russian Federation. The arrival of the Russians' Cossack expeditions pushing east across Siberia in search of fur, which was at that point one of the most valuable commodities in the world, transformed Yakutia's external connections without immediately transforming its internal logic. The Cossacks established forts, collected yasak, the fur tribute, from indigenous peoples, established trade networks, and gradually drew this vast cold territory into the administrative and economic orbit of the Russian state. The city of Yakutsk was founded as a Cossack fort in 1632, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited European-founded settlements in Siberia. The subsequent centuries brought Russian settlers, Orthodox missionaries, exiles, and political prisoners who will feature more prominently later in our story, and eventually the full machinery of imperial and then Soviet administration. But, and this is the remarkable part, the part that makes the Sakha story genuinely unusual in the history of colonized peoples, the cold itself functioned as a kind of protection. The extreme difficulty of getting to Yakutia, of surviving there without local knowledge, of extracting its resources at scale before modern technology, meant that Russian penetration of the region was always thinner, always more dependent on indigenous cooperation and knowledge, than in warmer territories. The Sakha maintained their language, their cultural practices, and significant elements of their social structure through the imperial period in ways that many other indigenous peoples of Russia did not. They adapted to Russian presence without fully dissolving into it, a balance achieved in part because the environment around them made full assimilation simply impractical. To survive here, you needed to know what the Sakha knew. You needed to know how to read the sky for weather, how to travel the river ice at different times of year, how to care for animals in conditions that killed animals elsewhere, how to build structures that stayed warm at -60, how to find food when the supply chain was 3 months of river travel away. This knowledge was not written down. It was embodied, passed from generation to generation through practice and observation and the particular kind of attention that only comes from knowing that getting it wrong has immediate and serious consequences. Lying in your warm hotel room tonight, thinking about this, thinking about the generations of knowledge that had to accumulate, piece by piece, failure and survival, in order to produce a people who could not just endure this cold but actually build something beautiful inside it, you might feel what travelers to Yakutia so often report feeling, a kind of humility that creeps up on you quietly. The cold out there is the same cold it has always been. The people who figured out how to live inside it did so without Gore-Tex, without heated hotel rooms, without the option of a return flight home. They figured it out because they had to, and what they figured out deserves to be called, without any condescension and with complete sincerity, one of the great achievements of human civilization. The ground beneath Yakutia is lying to you. It looks solid, it is solid in the sense that you can walk on it, build on it, drive across it, but it is not stable in the way that ground in most of the world is stable. Beneath the thin active layer that thaws each summer and refreezes each winter lies permafrost, permanently frozen ground that in some parts of Yakutia extends to a depth of 1.5 kilometers. 1.5 kilometers of frozen earth, ice, and ancient organic material, sitting beneath your feet like a geological memory of ice ages past, and every single structure, road, pipe, and foundation in this region exists in a constant, complicated negotiation with it. Building on permafrost is less like construction and more like a very slow, very expensive conversation with the planet, and the planet is not always in a cooperative mood. The word permafrost is relatively recent, coined in the 1940s by an American geologist named Seaman Muller, but the phenomenon itself is ancient, and the Sakha people understood its practical implications long before anyone gave it a scientific name. They knew that the ground didn't thaw deeply in summer. They knew that digging a cellar into the permafrost created a naturally refrigerated storage space that maintained a constant temperature of approximately -5 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to preserve meat and dairy indefinitely, without fluctuation, without the seasonal variation that makes above-ground storage unreliable. These permafrost cellars, dug by hand into the frozen ground, were in use for centuries before the concept of mechanical refrigeration existed anywhere on Earth. They are, in a meaningful sense, the world's oldest and most energy-efficient refrigerators, and they are still in use today. The engineering challenge of building on permafrost is not simply that the ground is frozen. It's that the relationship between the structure and the frozen ground is dynamic and treacherous. A heated building placed directly on permafrost transfers warmth downward into the ground. The permafrost beneath the building begins to thaw. Thawing permafrost is not simply frozen ground becoming unfrozen ground. It is a phase change that dramatically alters the mechanical properties of the soil. Water-saturated sediments that were rigid when frozen become soft, unstable, and prone to flowing when thawed. The building above sinks, tilts, cracks. Foundations shift. Walls separate. Roofs sag. The process is called thermokarst subsidence, and the older parts of Yakutsk are a living demonstration of what happens when it is not adequately addressed. Buildings that lean at improbable angles, staircases that no longer align with their landings, walls decorated with long diagonal cracks that tell the story of a foundation moving in a direction nobody planned. The solution that modern Yakutian engineering settled on is elegant in its counterintuitiveness. You build on stilts. Not metaphorical stilts, actual raised foundations, concrete or steel piles driven deep into the permafrost, with an air gap between the bottom of the building and the surface of the ground. This air gap, typically between 1 and 2 meters, allows cold air to circulate beneath the structure, preventing the building's warmth from conducting downward into the permafrost. The permafrost stays frozen. The frozen permafrost stays stable. The building stays level. It looks peculiar. An entire city of buildings hovering slightly above the ground, connected to the earth by columns like a forest of concrete legs. But it works, and the contrast between the older buildings that didn't use this approach and the newer ones that do is visible and instructive. Walking through Yakutsk, you can read the architectural history of the city's relationship with the permafrost almost like a geological record. The oldest Russian-era buildings, wooden structures from the 17th and 18th centuries that somehow still stand, have in many cases settled into the permafrost in complex ways. They found a new equilibrium, a kind of accommodation between structure and ground that took decades to reach but is now stable. The Soviet-era concrete apartment blocks from the mid-20th century represent a mixed picture. Some were built with adequate understanding of permafrost dynamics, some were not, and the latter category has produced buildings of considerable visual drama, leaning and cracked and propped up in various ways, many of them still occupied because in a city this remote, you don't easily walk away from housing even when the housing is doing something architecturally alarming. The newest construction, built with the full toolkit of modern permafrost engineering, sits on its piles with appropriate humility, elevated above the ground it dare not warm. The roads of Yakutia tell a similar story, except that roads have an even harder time with permafrost because they cannot be raised on piles. They must, by definition, rest on the surface, and the surface is exactly where the problem is. The main road connecting Yakutsk to the rest of Russia's highway network, a road that connects eventually to Magadan on the Pacific coast and carries the Grand Soviet-era name the Kolyma Highway, though locals and travelers call it the Road of Bones, is one of the most challenging drives on Earth, and not primarily because of the cold itself. The road's instability is the challenge. In summer, when the active layer thaws to a depth of perhaps half a meter, the road surface heaves, sinks, and develops spectacular potholes and ridges that can swallow an axle. In winter, when everything refreezes, the road becomes passable, brutally cold, isolated, occasionally terrifying, but at least solid. There is therefore a paradoxical seasonality to road travel in Yakutia. Summer, which everywhere else in the world makes travel easier, actually makes travel harder here. The Road of Bones earns its name from the period of its construction. Stalin's Gulag system used prisoners, many of them political prisoners, to build roads, railways, and mines across the Soviet Far East in conditions of staggering brutality. Historians still argue about the precise death toll from the Gulag system as a whole, but the consensus among scholars is that it ran into the hundreds of thousands, with some estimates considerably higher when you account for post-release mortality from health damage sustained during imprisonment. In Yakutia specifically, the combination of extreme climate, inadequate food and clothing, brutal working conditions, and deliberate indifference to prisoner welfare produced mortality rates that were extraordinarily high. Workers who died during road construction were, in some accounts, buried beneath or alongside the road itself, giving the highway its name, which is used today with a mixture of grim historical acknowledgement and the matter-of-fact practicality of people who have to drive it regardless. The Road of Bones, formerly the R504 Kolyma Highway, runs approximately 2,000 kilometers from Yakutsk to Magadan. To drive it in winter requires preparation that goes beyond simply having a functional vehicle. You need emergency supplies for multiple days, because rescue in the event of breakdown can take that long. You need the knowledge to keep your engine running, to identify and address problems before they strand you in temperatures that will kill you within hours without shelter. Convoys of vehicles sometimes travel together for mutual assistance. The road passes through landscapes of extraordinary beauty, frozen rivers, forest corridors, mountain passes, and through a silence so profound that first-time travelers consistently report finding it either deeply peaceful or deeply unnerving, with very little middle ground. The winter roads of Yakutia extend beyond the formal highway network through a system of seasonal ice roads, routes that exist only when the rivers and lakes they cross are frozen solid enough to bear vehicle weight. The Lena River, one of the great rivers of the world, flowing more than 4,000 kilometers from its source near Lake Baikal to its delta in the Arctic Ocean, serves as a winter road for several months of the year. Trucks carrying supplies to remote communities drive directly on the river ice, following routes marked by poles and reflectors, navigating a surface that is simultaneously the most reliable winter road available and a body of water that will, come spring, dissolve beneath you. The thickness of ice required for different vehicle weights is well understood. Passenger cars require approximately 25 centimeters, heavy trucks 60 centimeters or more, and the ice is measured and monitored throughout the winter. But the transition periods, when ice is forming in autumn and breaking up in spring, create weeks during which communities that depend on river crossing are effectively cut off. The spring breakup of the Lena is dramatic and occasionally violent. Enormous ice flows grinding and crashing downstream in a process that can flood riverside towns and has historically reshaped riverbanks and channels. Water infrastructure in Yakutia operates on principles that would seem extraordinary elsewhere. In Yakutsk, water is delivered to many areas through above-ground insulated pipes, the same elevated pipe systems we mentioned briefly before, which run between buildings on raised frames, looking from a distance like an extensive network of gray caterpillars threading through the urban landscape. These pipes must be kept above the permafrost to avoid the subsidence problems, and they must be continuously heated to prevent freezing. The heating is achieved through circulating warm water within a double pipe system, hot water flowing out, slightly cooler water returning, the whole system kept in motion because stationary water in these temperatures would freeze within hours. The energy cost of maintaining this infrastructure is significant and represents one of the genuine economic challenges of running a city in this climate. Sewage presents complementary challenges. Wastewater, even warmer than supply water, cannot be allowed to percolate into the permafrost, both because of contamination concerns and because the warmth of the effluent would destabilize the frozen ground around it. Sewage systems must therefore also be above ground in many areas, or buried in ways that prevent thermal transfer, or routed through structures that can be maintained and repaired. The visual result of all this above-ground infrastructure, water pipes, heating pipes, electrical conduits, sewage lines, is a cityscape that looks, to unaccustomed eyes, remarkably cluttered at ground level. Pipes and cables run everywhere, bridging buildings, crossing roads on overhead supports, creating a functional web of infrastructure that is fully visible rather than neatly hidden underground as it would be in most cities. Heating, obviously, is both the most important and the most demanding infrastructure challenge. Yakutsk's central heating system, a Soviet-era district heating network in which hot water is generated centrally and piped to buildings throughout the city, is the circulatory system on which the city's survival depends. In a place where a heating failure can become life-threatening within hours, the maintenance and redundancy of this system is a matter of genuine civic urgency. Soviet-era infrastructure of this type, built rapidly and often with shortcuts, has required continuous investment and upgrade across the post-Soviet decades. Power outages in Yakutsk in the depths of winter are not merely inconveniences. They are emergencies, and they are treated as such. The permafrost itself, interestingly, has become a resource as well as a challenge. Those natural permafrost cellars the Saka used for centuries have scaled up into something remarkable. The The Sharakovsky permafrost cellar near Yakutsk is a tunnel system dug into the permafrost that functions as a permanently frozen museum of sorts, open to tourists, where the walls are decorated with ice sculptures and the temperature hovers around -10 year-round regardless of season. It is Yakutia's version of a tourist attraction, and it is genuinely impressive, an underground world carved from frozen time, where the ice in the walls may be thousands of years old. Scientists also use permafrost as a long-term preservation medium, a frozen archive in which ancient biological material survives in conditions that no laboratory freezer can fully replicate, something we will return to in more detail when we talk about mammoths. The relationship between human settlement and permafrost is, in Yakutia, a relationship that requires constant attention and significant resources to maintain. There is no set and forget here, no infrastructure that you can install and then ignore for a generation. The permafrost moves, responds, shifts with seasonal temperature changes, and with longer-term climate trends, and every structure built on it must be monitored and adjusted accordingly. Buildings have thermistors, temperature sensors, installed in their foundations, monitoring ground temperature continuously. Roads are inspected each spring after the freeze-thaw cycle has done its worst. Ice roads are checked daily during the shoulder seasons. The whole built environment of Yakutia is, in a sense, in continuous conversation with the frozen ground beneath it, and the survival of the city depends on keeping that conversation going. You think about this as you lie warm in your hotel room, and you realize that somewhere beneath you, beneath the heated floor, beneath the building's raised foundation, beneath the air gap that keeps your warmth away from the earth, the permafrost extends downward into the planet, cold and patient and ancient, carrying in its frozen layers a record of climates and ecosystems that predate humanity entirely. The building above it floats on its concrete piles like a ship on a cold sea, and the people inside it sleep, warm and mostly unbothered, above 1.5 kilometers of frozen time. Food in Yakutia does not follow the rules you learned growing up. The categories that organize most cuisines, fresh versus preserved, cooked versus raw, appetizing versus alarming, all get reshuffled here into an arrangement driven entirely by one overriding principle: what keeps you alive at -60, and what can actually be produced, stored, and prepared in a landscape that spends 8 months of the year doing its best impression of the inside of a commercial freezer. The result is a cuisine that is genuinely unlike anything else on Earth, not because Yakutian cooks are eccentric for its own sake, but because the cold has been the chef here for centuries, and the cold has very specific ideas about what belongs on the menu. Start with stroganina, because it is the dish most associated with Yakutia in the minds of outsiders, and it is the dish that most efficiently communicates the cold's role in local food culture. Stroganina is raw frozen fish, typically whitefish, muksun, nelma, or chur, species pulled from the Lena River and its tributaries, that is eaten in its frozen state, shaved or sliced into thin curling strips directly from the solid block and consumed immediately, sometimes with salt, sometimes with nothing at all. The fish is not cooked. It is not cured. It is not marinated. It is simply frozen, which at Yakutian temperatures is immediate and complete, and then eaten frozen, the thin shavings melting slightly on the tongue as you eat them, releasing a clean, mild flavor that enthusiasts describe as the purest expression of the fish possible. No cooking chemistry altering the proteins, no salt or smoke masking the natural taste. To make stroganina properly, you hold the frozen fish by the tail and shave strips from it with a sharp knife, working from tail toward head, producing thin translucent curls that fall onto a cutting board or plate. The technique looks simple but requires practice. Too thick and the strips are unpleasant to eat, too thin and they warm too quickly. The fish must be frozen to the correct temperature, not the borderline cold of a domestic freezer, but the deep, complete freeze of a Yakutian winter, which produces a texture that is quite different from and superior to anything a commercial freezer achieves. This is not merely culinary snobbery. The structural difference between a fish frozen at -40 and one frozen at -18 is measurable in the texture of the flesh, in the way the ice crystals form between the muscle fibers, and stroganina made from fish frozen in a modern freezer is considered by locals to be a pale and somewhat disappointing imitation. The tradition of eating raw frozen food extends well beyond fish. Frozen raw liver, typically from reindeer or horse, is eaten in thin slices. and is considered both a delicacy and a practical source of vitamins that might otherwise be difficult to obtain in a diet heavily dependent on preserved and stored foods. Raw frozen horse meat is eaten in similar fashion, sliced thin from a frozen block. The logic is partly nutritional. Cooking destroys certain vitamins, particularly vitamin C, and in a landscape without fresh vegetables for much of the year, getting adequate nutrition from animal products requires eating some of them raw. The Inuit of northern Canada and Greenland arrived at similar dietary solutions through the same environmental pressure, and the parallel is instructive. When the cold is your primary food preservation technology, raw frozen food is not a cultural eccentricity but a nutritional necessity. Vitamin C is worth dwelling on for a moment because its absence killed an enormous number of European explorers and sailors who encountered cold environments without the dietary knowledge to maintain adequate intake. Scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was one of the great killers of Arctic and subarctic expeditions, and the failure of European explorers to learn from indigenous peoples who had solved this problem was an instance of cultural arrogance with sometimes fatal consequences. The Saka and other northern peoples obtained vitamin C from raw meat and organs, from the stomach contents of ruminant animals, from certain berries preserved in frozen conditions, from pine needle preparations. Historians still argue whether some of the catastrophic mortality rates of early European Arctic expeditions could have been avoided if their leaders had been more willing to adopt the dietary practices of the people who actually lived in these environments. But the evidence is suggestive enough to make the debate more than merely academic. The berries of Yakutia deserve their own appreciation. Cloudberries, crowberries, lingonberries, bogbilberries, these hardy plants produce fruit in the brief summer, and that fruit, left exposed to the first hard frosts of autumn, freezes in place on the plant and can be harvested throughout the winter. Frozen berries gathered directly from the snowfield are a traditional food, eaten as found or thawed slightly and eaten with milk or cream. Lingonberries in particular have a natural acidity and a high benzoic acid content that makes them naturally resistant to fermentation, allowing them to be stored for long periods. They are sometimes kept in water that freezes solid, essentially encasing the berries in a block of ice that can be chipped apart as needed through the winter. The nutritional value of these berries, especially as a source of vitamin C and antioxidants, was understood empirically long before the biochemistry was worked out. The role of the horse in Yakutian food culture extends beyond stroganina and raw frozen slices. Yakutian horse meat is the basis of a rich culinary tradition that encompasses soups, stews, sausages, and air-dried preparations that function as high-calorie portable food for travel and hunting. The fat of the Yakutian horse, that exceptionally high-fat meat we mentioned earlier, renders into a cooking medium and food source that provides extraordinary caloric density, critical in a cold environment where the body is burning significantly more energy than it would at temperate temperatures simply to maintain core temperature. A body at rest in -45 requires perhaps 50% more calories than the same body at rest in a comfortable room. A rough figure, but the principle is well established, and Yakutian traditional cuisine reflects it in every direction. Reindeer herding cultures of Yakutia's northern tundra have a food tradition that parallels the horse-based Saka tradition in its logic, while differing in its specifics. Reindeer provides meat, fat, hide, and blood, all of which are used. Reindeer blood soup, blood collected at slaughter, mixed with fat and sometimes stomach contents eaten fresh or cooked, is a traditional food of circumpolar peoples that is nutritionally dense and practically efficient, using parts of the animal that would otherwise be wasted. The stomach contents of a freshly slaughtered reindeer, which contain partially digested lichen and grasses, an ingredient not obtainable by any other means in the tundra environment, provide a source of vegetable matter and associated nutrients. Outsiders encountering these foods for the first time frequently struggle, which says more about the limits of their culinary imagination than about the food itself. Fermentation as a preservation strategy appears in Yakutian cuisine in forms calibrated to the cold. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, is the most prominent fermented product, central to Saka culture both as food and as the ceremonial drink of Isiak. The fermentation is a controlled process, producing a mildly alcoholic beverage with a sharp, slightly tangy flavor that experienced drinkers find refreshing and newcomers find challenging. Kumis has been produced across the Eurasian steppe for millennia. It appears in ancient Greek accounts of Scythian peoples, in medieval travelers' descriptions of Mongol hospitality, and the Saka tradition of kummis making represents a specific regional variation of this ancient technology. Surat, fermented and frozen yogurt-like dairy product, is another traditional staple, produced from the high-fat milk of Yakutian cattle and eaten with berries or on its own. The preparation of food in Yakutian conditions requires adapting cooking techniques to the reality that fire and fuel are precious resources and that outdoor cooking is a limited-season activity. Indoor cooking in traditional balagans was done over a central hearth that served simultaneously for heating and cooking, meaning that fuel efficiency was paramount, techniques that cooked slowly over low heat, that made maximum use of the heat generated, that could be left to cook while the cook did other things, predominated. Soups and stews are therefore central to the hot food tradition. Large pots of broth with meat and fat, sometimes thickened with blood or other additions, slow cooked until everything is soft and the broth is deeply flavored. These preparations are also forgiving of the dried, frozen, and preserved ingredients that make up the winter pantry, coaxing flavor and nutrition from ingredients that might seem unpromising to outside eyes. The hunting tradition of Yakutia has shaped the food culture in ways that extend beyond the simple equation of animal equals food. The tracking of game across frozen landscape, the knowledge of where different species will be found in different seasons and weather conditions, the techniques for approaching and killing prey cleanly, all of this represents a body of knowledge that took generations to accumulate and that was transmitted through practice, story, and the particular mentorship of experienced hunters. Brown bear hunting bears are found throughout the Yakutian taiga, was both a practical food source and a ritual activity, with the bear occupying a significant place in the spiritual cosmology of multiple indigenous groups in the region. The killing of a bear required acknowledgement and ceremony, an expression of respect for the animal's power and spirit, and the consumption of bear meat was associated with taking on something of the bear's qualities: its strength, its endurance, its ability to survive the cold. Ice fishing is perhaps the most visually striking food-gathering practice of Yakutia, and it continues today in forms that would be recognizable to practitioners from centuries past. A hole is cut through ice that may be a meter or more thick, using an auger or a specialized ice chisel. Lines are set, sometimes many lines from a single location, sometimes extended along a series of holes cut in a line. In the coldest periods, ice forms over the hole almost immediately after cutting, and the fisher must keep it clear throughout the day. The fish pulled from the Lena and its tributaries, including the enormous Siberian sturgeon, which can reach several meters in length, freeze almost instantly in the air as they are lifted from the water, a natural preservation that begins before the fisher has reached the shore. This immediate freezing is considered optimal for the production of stroganina. The freshness of the fish is locked in by the cold at the moment of its death. A quirky footnote to Yakutian food history: the city of Yakutsk has, in recent decades, developed a small but genuine restaurant culture that plays self-consciously with the traditional food tradition in ways that reflect global culinary trends. Restaurants serving deconstructed stroganina, reindeer preparations presented with modern plating techniques, kummis-based cocktails, the cold cuisine of the Saka meeting the aesthetics of contemporary dining. Food critics from Moscow and occasionally from further afield have made the journey to Yakutsk specifically to engage with this tradition, and there is something rather wonderful about the idea of a tasting menu built around -60 survival food, served in a heated dining room while the temperature outside would kill an unprepared person within minutes. The cold remains the context. It simply has better lighting now. The food of Yakutia does something that the food of most places does not do quite so literally. It keeps you alive in conditions that would otherwise kill you. Not through exotic ingredients or elaborate technique, but through a centuries-long process of learning what the cold demands and providing it. High fat, high protein, raw where cooking would destroy too much, preserved by the most abundant preservation medium on Earth. Every dish, every ingredient, every technique in the traditional food culture of this place is an answer to the same question. How do you feed a human body in -70 degrees? The answers are strange and sometimes challenging and occasionally genuinely delicious. You close your eyes and think about that clean, cold flavor of fish melting on the tongue, and the warmth of broth made rich with horse fat, and the sharp brightness of a frozen lingonberry, and somewhere between those imagined flavors the cold outside your window hums its quiet, relentless hum, and the night deepens around you. The animals of Yakutia did not receive a memo explaining that this environment was incompatible with life. They simply got on with it, and in doing so produced a collection of biological solutions to the problem of extreme cold that range from the elegant to the frankly bizarre, from the well-documented to the still debated, from the ancient to the recently rediscovered. The fauna of this frozen world is a living laboratory of evolutionary adaptation, and spending time with it, even from the safe distance of a warm bed on a cold night, is one of the more humbling experiences available to anyone interested in what life is actually capable of. Start with the animal that most people associate with Yakutia, even though it has been dead for thousands of years: the woolly mammoth. Mammuthus primigenius roamed across the Eurasian steppe and into North America during the Pleistocene epoch, and Yakutia was one of their strongholds. The cold, dry grassland ecosystem called the mammoth steppe that covered much of northern Siberia during glacial periods was prime mammoth habitat. And the permafrost of Yakutia has preserved their remains with a fidelity that no other environment on Earth can match. Mammoth bones, tusks, teeth, and occasionally entire bodies, skin, fur, muscle, internal organs intact, emerge from Yakutia's permafrost with a regularity that has made the region the world's primary source of mammoth material. Tusks in particular are a significant commercial commodity, sold as a legal alternative to elephant ivory to the global luxury goods market, and the trade in mammoth ivory supports a not insignificant segment of the Yakutian economy. The completeness of some permafrost mammoth finds is staggering. The mammoth known as Luba, discovered in 2007 on the Yamal Peninsula, just west of Yakutia proper, was a 1-month-old calf preserved so completely that her eyelashes were intact, the contents of her stomach were identifiable, and the bacteria that had been living in her intestines at the moment of her death were recoverable for analysis. She had been dead for approximately 42,000 years. The preservation quality of these specimens has allowed researchers to sequence the woolly mammoth genome in considerable detail, providing a basis for the ongoing and scientifically contentious project of mammoth de-extinction, the attempt to use gene editing technology to introduce mammoth traits into the genome of the Asian elephant, the mammoth's closest living relative. Historians and geneticists still argue whether this project represents a genuine conservation possibility or an expensive exercise in scientific overreach, but the conversation would not be happening at all without the extraordinary preservation quality of Yakutia's permafrost. The question of why mammoths went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago at the end of the last glacial period, with a small relict population surviving on Wrangel Island until about 4,000 years ago, is one of the more contentious debates in quaternary science. The two main hypotheses are climate change, which transformed the cold mammoth steppe into warmer, wetter tundra and boreal forest that could not support large herds, and human hunting pressure, as expanding human populations in the late Pleistocene were efficient hunters of large, slow-reproducing mammals. Most current researchers favor some combination of both, with the relative contribution of each factor varying by region. In Yakutia, where both pressures were present, the debate is particularly live, and it connects to broader questions about the role of large herbivores in maintaining cold climate ecosystems, questions with practical implications for the rewilding projects currently underway in the region. The Pleistocene Park Project, established in the late 1990s in northern Yakutia by ecologist Sergei Zimov and continued by his son Nikita, is an attempt to restore something approximating the mammoth steppe ecosystem by reintroducing large grazing animals, bison, horses, musk oxen, reindeer, to the tundra and allowing their grazing and trampling behavior to gradually restore the grassland that characterized the region during the mammoth's heyday. The project operates on the hypothesis that the mammoth steppe was not simply the vegetation type associated with a cold climate, but was actively maintained by the grazing pressure of the large herbivore community. That mammoths and their contemporaries were ecosystem engineers whose activities kept the grassland open and productive, and that their extinction allowed the tundra and boreal forest to expand in their place. It is a bold idea, and the jury is still very much out on whether it works at scale, but the preliminary results have been interesting enough to attract serious scientific attention and significant funding. The living animals of Yakutia are no less remarkable than its extinct ones. The Siberian tiger, the largest cat on Earth, ranges across the Russian Far East, with its western boundary brushing the eastern edges of Yakutia. But the more characteristic large predator of the Yakutian taiga is the wolf, and the wolves of this region are among the largest in the world, a size pattern called Bergmann's rule, which holds that within a species, Individuals tend to be larger in colder climates because a larger body has a more favorable surface area to volume ratio for heat retention. A Yakutian wolf is a genuinely impressive animal, potentially weighing over 80 kilograms, covered in dense fur, capable of maintaining pursuit across terrain that would exhaust most other animals, and operating in temperatures that no temperate zone predator would function in without significant biological modification. The wolverine, a member of the weasel family that has achieved a kind of mythological status in cold climate cultures partly through its actual ferocity and partly through the enthusiasm of comic book writers, is well adapted to Yakutian conditions in ways that are worth examining. Wolverines have large, snowshoe-like paws that distribute their weight over soft snow, allowing them to travel efficiently across surfaces that would trap heavier animals. Their fur is uniquely resistant to frost. The outer guard hairs have a quality that prevents moisture from freezing to them, which is why wolverine fur was the preferred material for lining the hoods of traditional cold climate garments. Indigenous peoples across the Arctic and subarctic independently identified this property and valued wolverine fur accordingly, a convergent cultural discovery that reflects the animal's genuine engineering excellence. Wolverines are also famous for their ability to consume frozen carcasses. Their jaw muscles and teeth are powerful enough to crush frozen bone that other scavengers cannot access, giving them a winter food source that most of the competition cannot exploit. The Siberian roe deer, the elk, called moose in North America, and the reindeer are the primary large herbivores of Yakutia's taiga and tundra, and each has developed specific adaptations to cold that reward attention. Reindeer hooves are remarkable structures. The outer rim of the hoof is hard and sharp for gripping ice, while the central pad shrinks in cold weather, exposing more of the hard rim and improving traction on frozen surfaces. In summer, when the ground is soft, the same pad expands, providing better flotation on wet tundra. The hoof is essentially a seasonal adaptive tool, switching function between summer and winter without any conscious involvement from the animal. Reindeer also have nasal passages of unusual complexity. The turbinate bones in the nose create an elaborate surface area over which inhaled air is warmed before reaching the lungs, and over which exhaled air releases much of its heat back to the incoming breath. The result is a heat exchange system of remarkable efficiency, warming cold outside air to safe temperatures and recovering a significant fraction of the heat that would otherwise be lost in each breath. The Siberian chipmunk and the various vole species of Yakutia take a different approach to winter entirely, hibernation and subnivean living, respectively. The chipmunk retreats to a burrow well before the worst of winter arrives, enters a state of reduced metabolic activity, and survives on cached food stores, waking periodically to eat and then returning to torpor. The voles, smaller and unable to store enough fat or food for full hibernation, instead exploit the insulating properties of deep snow. They live and move in tunnels beneath the snowpack, where temperatures stay relatively stable at approximately -5, even when the surface temperature is -50 or worse. The subnivean space, the world beneath the snow, is its own ecosystem, with its own food sources, its own predators, and its own climate, and the animals that inhabit it are exploiting a thermal refuge created by the very snow that makes the surface so hostile. The birds of Yakutia present a fascinating sorting problem. Some stay through the winter, some arrive for the summer, and the logic of which species do which is not always immediately obvious. The Siberian jay, a compact, opportunistic corvid relative, remains year-round, caching food in summer and retrieving it through the winter with a spatial memory that researchers have found impressive, even by corvid standards. The raven, that most cold-adapted of large corvids, is also a year-round resident. Ravens are found at the North Pole on Arctic islands, in conditions that would suggest the edge of avian possibility, and their success in these environments relates to their extraordinary behavioral flexibility and their willingness to exploit whatever food sources are available, including following wolves and other predators to scavenge their kills. The Siberian tit, a tiny bird of perhaps 12 grams, somehow survives Yakutian winters by roosting communally in tree cavities, fluffing its feathers to create maximum insulating airspace, and entering a mild nocturnal hypothermia that reduces its metabolic needs through the long cold night. The insects of Yakutia, and yes, there are insects in extraordinary abundance during the brief summer, deserve a mention primarily because of the contrast they provide. The mosquitoes of Yakutian summer are legendary in the way that very unpleasant things become legendary. There are accounts of horses being driven mad by mosquito swarms, of the summer air being so thick with insects that breathing without a head net is genuinely unpleasant, of visitors from warm climates who survived the winter cold and then were completely undone by the summer insects. The irony of a place famous for its extreme cold becoming, for 2 or 3 summer months, an insect hell is not lost on anyone who has spent a full year in Yakutia. The insects survive the winter in egg or larval form, frozen into the permafrost or the ice of ponds and rivers, emerging when the thaw comes with what can only be described as accumulated enthusiasm. Fish in the rivers and lakes of Yakutia have developed physiological adaptations that allow them to survive in water that is, for much of the year, just barely above the freezing point. Several species found in Yakutian waters produce antifreeze proteins, compounds that prevent ice crystal formation in body fluids at temperatures where water alone would freeze. This biochemistry, first identified in Antarctic fish and subsequently found in multiple cold water species around the world, represents one of evolution's more elegant solutions to the problem of liquid water at sub-zero temperatures, and it has attracted considerable interest from biotechnology researchers looking for applications in food preservation, cryogenic medicine, and materials science. The fish worked out the problem millions of years before the engineers got to it. A genuinely strange and somewhat unsettling phenomenon associated with Yakutia's permafrost is the emergence of ancient organisms from the frozen ground. Not just mammoths and their preserved biology, but living things that have been frozen for extraordinary lengths of time and, upon thawing, resume biological activity. Nematode worms, tiny, nearly invisible roundworms, have been recovered from permafrost dating to 28,000 years old and have been revived to active life upon thawing, moving, and eating in laboratory conditions. Moss and other plant material frozen for thousands of years has been successfully grown from permafrost samples. Bacteria isolated from permafrost hundreds of meters deep have resumed metabolic activity when warmed. The boundaries of what counts as dead versus merely paused, in the context of Yakutian permafrost, are considerably less clear than they are elsewhere, and the implications of this, particularly as the permafrost thaws and releases whatever it has been holding, are something that researchers are paying increasing attention to. You drift slightly in the warmth of your room, thinking about the wolverine with its frost-resistant fur, about the fish with antifreeze in its blood, about the nematode worm that slept in the ice for 28,000 years and woke up and went looking for breakfast. The cold outside has produced these things, selected for them, shaped them, rewarded the strategies that worked, and quietly eliminated the ones that didn't, over timescales that make human history look like an afternoon. The living world of Yakutia is the cold's greatest achievement, a catalog of solutions to an impossible problem, and the pages of that catalog are still being read. There is a paradox sitting at the heart of Yakutia's relationship with the modern world, and it goes something like this. The most hostile, permanently inhabited environment on Earth is also, by certain measures, one of the wealthiest regions in Russia. The ground that freezes to minus 71 degrees Celsius, that kills the unprepared within minutes, that resists infrastructure and agriculture and every comfortable assumption about how human civilization is supposed to work. That same ground is stuffed, almost absurdly, with valuable things. Diamonds, gold, coal, natural gas, mammoth ivory, and a landscape so extreme that people will pay considerable sums of money simply to come and stand in it. The cold that makes everything harder has also, in a roundabout way, made Yakutia rich, and the story of how that wealth was extracted, who benefited, and what it cost is one of the more complicated economic narratives of the 20th and 21st centuries. Begin with diamonds, because Yakutia's diamonds are genuinely remarkable in their scale. The Sakha Republic produces roughly a quarter of the world's rough diamonds by volume, a figure that has fluctuated over the decades but has consistently placed the region among the top diamond-producing territories on the planet. The diamonds are extracted primarily by Alrosa, the Russian state-controlled diamond mining company, from kimberlite pipe deposits concentrated in the western part of the republic, around the city of Mirny. The Mirny mine, now exhausted and converted to open-pit status before being partially flooded, was at its peak the largest open diamond mine in the world. A hole in the earth 525 meters deep and 1,200 meters wide, so large that helicopters were banned from flying over it because the updrafts from the pit were strong enough to pull small aircraft downward. It is one of those human-made structures that photographs do not adequately convey. It looks, from the air, like someone has simply removed a significant piece of the planet and left a geometric void behind. The discovery of Yakutia's diamond deposits was a Soviet-era achievement, and its story begins in the early 1950s when geologists working under considerable pressure. Stalin's Soviet Union was eager to develop domestic diamond supplies rather than depending on foreign sources, were systematically surveying the vast, largely unmapped territory of the Sakha Republic. The geologist Larissa Popigieva is credited with identifying the first kimberlite indicator minerals in the Yakutian soil in 1953, a discovery that led rapidly to the identification of actual kimberlite pipes and the beginning of what would become one of the most significant mining operations in Soviet history. The conditions under which the initial exploration was conducted, geologists working on foot and by small aircraft across landscapes that had barely been surveyed, in temperatures that required extraordinary logistical support, with the constant institutional pressure of a state apparatus that expected results, represent a chapter of scientific and human endurance that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The gold deposits of Yakutia have a longer extraction history, predating the Soviet period and running back through the Russian imperial era to the 19th century gold rushes that brought prospectors to Siberia in waves roughly analogous to the better-known rushes in California and the Klondike. Gold mining in Yakutia's river valleys and mountain ranges has been continuous, in various forms, since the 1840s, and the region remains a significant gold producer. The methods of extraction have changed dramatically, from individual placer mining in river gravels to large-scale industrial operations, but the geography of gold in Yakutia has not, and some of the areas first prospected in the 19th century are still being worked with modern equipment today. Coal, natural gas, and oil complete the fossil fuel picture of Yakutia's resource wealth, and their extraction adds another layer to the economic and environmental complexity of the region. The Elga coal deposit in southeastern Yakutia is one of the largest coking coal deposits in the world, and its development, connected to distant markets by a railway line that had to be built across hundreds of kilometers of permafrost terrain at extraordinary cost, represents the kind of infrastructure gamble that makes financial sense only when the deposit is large enough and the market strong enough. The Shandinskoye natural gas field feeds the Power of Siberia pipeline, a major infrastructure project completed in 2019 that carries Yakutian natural gas to China, a supply relationship that reflects both the global scale of Yakutia's resource significance and the geopolitical context in which that significance operates. The labor that built much of Yakutia's resource extraction infrastructure in the Soviet period was, in large part, not voluntary. The Gulag system that gave the Road of Bones its name also provided the workforce for gold mines, coal operations, and construction projects throughout the Kolyma and Yakutian regions. The Dalstroy organization, a Soviet entity that combined the functions of a mining corporation and a prison camp administration, operated across the northeastern extremes of the Soviet Union from the 1930s through the 1950s, extracting gold and other resources through prisoner labor in conditions that combined industrial exploitation with deliberate brutality. The human cost was immense. Scholars have estimated that several 100,000 people died in the Kolyma camps alone over the course of the Dalstroy period, from cold, starvation, overwork, and direct violence. The gold extracted during this period flowed to the Soviet state treasury, helping to finance industrialization and military buildup, while the men and women who extracted it were buried in the permafrost alongside the roads they built. The mammoth ivory trade represents one of Yakutia's more unusual economic activities, and one that sits at the intersection of paleontology, conservation politics, and luxury goods commerce in ways that generate ongoing controversy. As permafrost erodes, both through natural seasonal thaw and, increasingly, through climate-driven deeper thaw, it releases mammoth remains, and the tusks in particular are recovered by licensed hunters who patrol riverbanks and eroding bluffs each summer. Mammoth ivory is legal to trade internationally, unlike elephant ivory, which has been subject to a near-total international trade ban since 1989. The mammoth ivory market therefore attracts demand from luxury goods makers, carvers, jewelers, musical instrument manufacturers, who might otherwise have used elephant ivory. Conservationists are divided on whether this trade benefits elephant conservation by providing a legal alternative, or whether it undermines it by keeping the market for ivory products active and providing cover for laundering illegal elephant ivory. Historians and conservationists still argue whether the net effect of the mammoth ivory trade on elephant populations is positive, negative, or neutral, and the empirical evidence is not yet conclusive. The tourism industry of Yakutia is small by global standards but growing, and it has developed a character that reflects the extreme nature of what it is selling. The primary draw is the cold itself. Tourists come to Oymyakon specifically to experience the coldest inhabited place on Earth, to photograph the thermometer at -60, to breathe air that freezes immediately, to participate in the local custom of throwing boiling water into the air and watching it evaporate or freeze before reaching the ground. This last activity, the so-called boiling water challenge, which works because at extreme cold the tiny water droplets in a thrown jet of boiling water cool and evaporate or freeze almost instantaneously, has become a staple of Yakutian tourism photography and generates a reliable stream of dramatic social media content. It also occasionally generates frostbitten hands among tourists who misjudge the wind direction, but that is a detail that tends not to make it into the Instagram captions. The journey to Oymyakon is itself part of the tourist experience. The 900-kilometer drive from Yakutsk along the Road of Bones, typically in a convoy of SUVs with experienced local drivers, takes 2 to 3 days depending on conditions and passes through landscapes that are genuinely breathtaking in their scale and emptiness. Several guest houses have been established in Oymyakon to receive the modest but steady stream of visitors, and the village, population around 500, which has been declining slowly as younger residents seek opportunities in Yakutsk or beyond, has developed a small infrastructure of tourist amenities while maintaining the authentic character that makes it interesting in the first place. The local guest house experience typically involves sleeping in a warm room, eating traditional food, and participating in outdoor activities, ice fishing, reindeer or horse riding, dog sledding, that are simultaneously genuine local practices and highly effective tourist experiences. The Yakutsk diamond industry has produced a cultural amenity that seems incongruous with the city's remote, industrial character. The Mammoth Museum and the Treasury of the Sakha Republic, both of which house collections of remarkable quality. The Treasury, which displays historical Sakha gold and jewelry alongside contemporary diamond set pieces produced by local craftspeople, reflects the conversion of raw resource wealth into cultural capital, a process that most resource-rich regions attempt and many fail at, but that Yakutsk has managed with some success. The jewelry tradition of the Sakha, which predates the diamond industry by centuries and encompasses elaborate silver work as well as gold, has been sustained and enriched rather than displaced by the modern gem trade, producing a contemporary craft tradition that draws on historical forms while incorporating new materials and techniques. The relationship between the Sakha Republic and the Russian federal government over the disposition of resource revenues has been a source of political tension throughout the post-Soviet period. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the Sakha Republic briefly declared sovereignty over its natural resources, a declaration that reflected the widely shared sentiment among Yakutian political leaders that the wealth extracted from their territory had historically flowed elsewhere while the local population bore the costs of extraction. The subsequent negotiation of the republic's status within the Russian Federation produced a series of agreements that gave Sakha somewhat more control over and benefit from its resources than most other Russian regions enjoy, though the balance of benefit remains a contested political question. The diamonds of Mirny and the gold of the Kolyma tributaries have made shareholders of Alrosa and the Russian state very wealthy. The degree to which that wealth has translated into improved conditions for the indigenous peoples of the Republic is a matter of perspective and measurement, and the perspectives vary considerably. A quirky footnote to Yakutia's economic story: the region has developed, somewhat improbably, a domestic film industry. Yakutian cinema, films made in the Yakut language, reflecting local culture and stories, produced on modest budgets by local filmmakers, has attracted international attention over the past 2 decades, with several films screened at major international festivals and distributed beyond Russia. The emergence of a recognizable Yakutian film aesthetic, often incorporating elements of traditional cosmology, the specific visual character of the landscape, And the social dynamics of contemporary Saka life represents a form of cultural wealth that sits alongside and sometimes in tension with the extractive resource wealth. A people who have been the subjects of others' stories for centuries are, increasingly, telling their own, and the cold landscape that forms the backdrop of those stories gives them a visual distinctiveness that no other cinema in the world quite replicates. The economy of extreme cold, then, is both simpler and more complicated than it first appears. Simpler because the logic is ultimately the same logic that drives resource extraction everywhere. Valuable things are in the ground, people want them, someone finds a way to get them out. More complicated because the costs of extraction in this environment are extraordinary, because the human history of how those costs were born is dark and ongoing, because the distribution of benefits has never been simple or fair, and because the cold that makes everything harder also makes the place unique in ways that generate their own kind of value, in tourism, in cultural identity, in the simple fact of being somewhere that most of the world cannot imagine surviving. The cold outside your window is, among other things, an economic force. It has shaped what Yakutia produces, how it produces it, who has come here and why, and what has happened to the people who were already here when the others arrived. These are not comfortable thoughts, perhaps, for a bedtime story, but they are the honest ones, and Yakutia has never been a place that rewarded dishonesty about its conditions. Cold kills with a patience that no other natural force quite matches. It does not strike like lightning or surge like a flood. It simply continues, steady and thorough, extracting heat from everything it touches with the unhurried confidence of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. In Yakutia, the cold has killed explorers and prisoners and wanderers, and the merely unlucky claimed them in ways ranging from the dramatic to the quietly mundane, and left behind a ledger of deaths that is both a historical record and a practical warning. But the cold has also preserved, with a fidelity and completeness that no human technology has matched, bodies, objects, ecosystems, and stories that would otherwise have been lost to the ordinary decay that warmth enables. In Yakutia, death and preservation are the same transaction, conducted in the same currency, at the same temperature. The deaths begin early in the historical record of European contact with this region. The Cossack expeditions that pushed into Yakutia in the 17th century suffered significant cold-related casualties. Though the records are incomplete and the causes of death were not always carefully distinguished, cold, starvation, scurvy, and violence from conflicted interactions with indigenous peoples were all present simultaneously, and the administrative records of the period tend toward the bureaucratic rather than the descriptive. What is clear is that early Russian presence in Yakutia was maintained at significant human cost, and that the people who survived their first winters in the region did so largely by learning from the Saka, adopting their clothing, their housing practices, their food strategies, and their knowledge of how to move through the landscape without dying in it. The clothing of cold survival is worth its own examination, because getting it wrong kills you and getting it right is a sophisticated achievement that took generations to develop. The fundamental principle of cold weather clothing is layering. Not a single thick garment, but multiple layers of different materials, each serving a different function. The innermost layer manages moisture, drawing sweat away from the skin, because wet skin loses heat dramatically faster than dry skin. The middle layers insulate, trapping warm air close to the body in a network of tiny pockets created by the structure of the material, whether that's the interlocking fibers of wool or the hollow shafts of down feathers or the stiff guard hairs of animal fur. The outer layer blocks wind and precipitation while ideally remaining somewhat breathable. Traditional Saka cold weather clothing achieved all of these functions with materials available in the local environment. Reindeer hide, in particular, has properties that make it extraordinarily effective as an insulating outer layer. The individual hairs of reindeer fur are hollow, creating an air-filled insulating column in each strand, and the density of the coat traps an enormous volume of still air. Saka garments often used multiple layers of fur, with an inner layer worn fur-side in against the body and an outer layer worn fur-side out, trapping insulating air between them. Boots, the most critical garment in extreme cold, because feet are the extremities most vulnerable to frostbite and because good footwear makes movement possible while bad footwear makes it fatal, were constructed with similarly refined attention. The traditional Saka boot, the Eterbais, was designed with a turned-up toe that prevented snow accumulation and a sole of specially prepared hide that remained relatively flexible even at very low temperatures. The explorers who came to Yakutia from outside, European and Russian adventurers, surveyors, scientists, sorted themselves quickly into two categories: those who adopted indigenous clothing practices and those who did not. The survival statistics of these two groups are not subtle. Explorers who wore European-style clothing in Yakutian conditions were cold, frequently frostbitten, sometimes dead. Those who wore reindeer or other animal fur in the indigenous style survived. The lesson was relearned repeatedly by different expeditions in different centuries, and the persistence with which some European explorers clung to their own clothing traditions even in the face of clear evidence that it was killing them is one of the more puzzling human behaviors in the history of exploration, a combination of cultural pride, institutional inertia, and possibly a genuine failure to believe that the indigenous solution was superior rather than merely different. The Gulag period brought death to Yakutia on an industrial scale, as we touched on earlier, and the specifics of cold-related mortality in the camps deserve more attention than they typically receive in general histories of the Soviet prison system. The camps of the Kolyma region and eastern Yakutia operated year-round, including through winters that regularly produced temperatures below -50. Prisoners were required to work outdoors in these conditions in clothing that was frequently inadequate, worn thin, without proper layering, with boots that had deteriorated beyond their useful life and had not been replaced. The caloric rations provided to prisoners were insufficient for the metabolic demands of outdoor labor in extreme cold. A body working hard in -50 requires perhaps 3 times the calories of a body at rest in a warm room, and the gap between what was provided and what was needed was often lethal. Prisoners who stopped producing their work quotas received reduced rations, a policy that accelerated the physiological decline of those who were already too cold and too hungry to maintain their output, creating a death spiral that the administration understood perfectly well and chose not to address. The cold of the camps also created specific forms of suffering beyond simple freezing. Fingers and toes lost to frostbite were common. A former prisoner could often be identified by missing digits, a physical record of a winter in the camps that no amount of time or warmth could erase. The combination of malnutrition and cold exposure produced a distinctive syndrome: pellagra from niacin deficiency, scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, edema from protein deficiency, all interacting with the physiological stress of cold to produce deterioration that moved faster and was harder to reverse than any single condition alone. The survivors, and there were survivors, people who came through years in these camps and eventually returned to something resembling ordinary life, carried the physical and psychological marks of their time in the cold for the rest of their lives. The cold kills, yes, but it also preserves, and this aspect of Yakutia's relationship with death is genuinely extraordinary. The permafrost is an archive, a frozen record of biological history that extends back through tens of thousands of years, and the things it has preserved range from the scientifically invaluable to the personally poignant. We have already discussed the mammoths at some length, but the permafrost of Yakutia has also preserved the remains of woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, ancient horses, bison, and the full ecological community of the Pleistocene steppe. Not as fossils, the mineralized replacements of original material, but as actual original biological tissue, frozen in place at the moment of death and maintained in that state ever since. The scientific value of this material is difficult to overstate. It provides a direct window into ecosystems that existed before human civilization, before agriculture, before the great extinctions of the late Pleistocene, preserved in a detail that no other archive can match. Human remains in the permafrost tell more intimate stories. Archaeological excavations in Yakutia have recovered human burials from various periods of the region's human history, and the preservation quality of permafrost burials can be remarkable. Clothing, tools, food offerings, and sometimes soft tissue preserved in conditions that allow researchers to extract DNA, to analyze diet from stable isotopes in bone and hair, to reconstruct aspects of daily life from the objects interred with the dead. These are not anonymous biological samples but specific people, whose clothing and grave goods speak of their status and their culture, who sometimes can be connected through DNA analysis to living descendants among the modern Saka population. The cold has kept them, held them in suspension across centuries, and returned them to the attention of their descendants in a form that feels more like interrupted sleep than death. The preservative power of extreme cold has practical applications that Yakutia has long exploited and that the modern world is increasingly taking seriously. The natural permafrost cellars of the Saka tradition, those hand-dug refrigerators we mentioned in the context of food storage, have a contemporary analog in the global seed vault at Svalbard, Norway, where seeds of crop plants from around the world are stored in permafrost tunnels against the possibility of catastrophic agricultural collapse. The logic is identical to what the Saka understood empirically centuries ago. Frozen ground maintains a constant low temperature without mechanical intervention, without energy input, without the risk of equipment failure. The cold is the technology, and it is more reliable than anything humans have built. Medical science has developed significant interest in the mechanisms of cold preservation as they apply to human tissue and potentially to human bodies. Cryonics, the practice of preserving recently deceased individuals in liquid nitrogen with the hope that future technology will enable revival and treatment of whatever caused their death, draws on the same basic principle, though at far more extreme temperatures and with considerably more technological intervention. The nematode worms revived from 28,000-year-old permafrost, the bacteria resumed from ancient frozen ground. These findings are taken seriously in cryonics research as evidence that biological revival after long-term cold preservation is not inherently impossible, even if the specific mechanisms applicable to complex animals like humans are far from worked out. Historians of science still argue whether cryonics represents a legitimate field of research or an elaborate comfort for people unwilling to accept mortality, but the permafrost biology of Yakutia keeps providing data points that keep the question open. The cold has also preserved historical events in unusual ways. The bodies of people who died in Yakutia in the 18th and 19th centuries, travelers, exiles, miners, have occasionally been recovered from permafrost in states of preservation that made them initially appear to be recently deceased, causing considerable confusion and occasional alarm before the circumstances were established. A grim but genuine quirky footnote. There are documented cases from the Soviet period of permafrost construction work uncovering human remains in such good condition that the workers stopped work and called the police, who arrived to find not a recent crime scene but a 19th century burial. The cold had preserved the body more effectively than the most sophisticated modern embalming, and the visual result was disturbing in a way that a skeleton never is, the full form of a person intact from a century and a half ago. The cold's relationship with fire, the primary technology of warmth and therefore of survival in Yakutia, produces one final and important observation. In conditions of extreme cold, fire is not a luxury or a comfort. It is a boundary between life and death, and the maintenance of fire becomes a moral obligation as much as a practical one. Traditional Saka culture encoded this understanding in specific customs and prohibitions around fire. The hearth was sacred. Fire was not to be extinguished carelessly. Guests were to be warmed before any other obligation was attended to. The moral weight placed on hospitality in cold climate cultures generally, and in Saka culture specifically, derives from this simple physical reality. In -60, a stranger turned away from your fire might not survive to reach the next one. Hospitality was not courtesy, it was ethics made urgent by physics. You lie in the warmth of your room, and you think about the cold as a keeper of things. Keeper of the dead, keeper of the ancient, keeper of stories frozen in place and waiting to be read. The permafrost beneath the city holds all of this, patient and cold and extraordinarily thorough, and the warmth of the room you're in is a temporary condition, a local exception to the cold's general rule. Outside, the temperature continues its nightly fall, and the cold continues its patient work of preservation, holding things in suspension until someone comes to find them. Everything that has held Yakutia together, the permafrost beneath its buildings, the ice roads across its rivers, the frozen cellars beneath its homes, the ancient cold that preserved its mammoths and shaped its people and made its diamonds possible to find, is becoming less reliable. The temperature in the Saka Republic has risen by an average of approximately 3 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years, roughly twice the global average warming rate, because the Arctic and subarctic regions amplify climate change through feedback mechanisms that scientists understood theoretically before they began observing them empirically, and are now watching unfold in real time with a mixture of scientific fascination and genuine alarm. Yakutia is not merely experiencing climate change, It is experiencing it faster and more dramatically than almost anywhere else on Earth, and the consequences for the physical landscape, the built environment, the ecosystems, and the people who have built their entire civilization around the cold are cascading through every system simultaneously. The permafrost is thawing. Not everywhere, not all at once, not even necessarily to great depth yet in most places. But the active layer, the surface zone that thaws each summer and refreezes each winter, is thickening. Ground that used to thaw to 30 centimeters now thaws to 40 or 50. Ground that used to refreeze completely each autumn is taking longer to do so, and in some areas the refreezing is incomplete. The permafrost table is dropping, pulling back from the surface, leaving a zone of unstable, partially frozen ground between the surface and the remaining permafrost below. This sounds like a technical detail, but its consequences at the surface are dramatic and visible. Buildings on pile foundations designed for 1 permafrost depth are finding their piles extending into ground that is no longer frozen solid. Roads that were engineered for a particular active layer thickness are experiencing subsidence at rates that were not anticipated. The thermokarst landscape, that terrain of sinkholes, tilted trees, and irregular bumpy ground created by permafrost thaw, is expanding across areas that were stable within living memory. In Yakutsk, the practical consequences are already significant. Engineers monitoring the ground temperature beneath buildings throughout the city have documented warming trends in the permafrost that have accelerated markedly since the 1990s. Buildings that were stable for decades are now showing new signs of foundation movement. The cost of maintaining buildings on thawing permafrost, adding refrigeration systems to refreeze the ground beneath foundations, deepening piles, reinforcing structures, is substantial and growing. Some older buildings are being assessed as no longer economically viable to maintain in their current form, a calculation that is being made across Siberia's permafrost cities simultaneously, and that represents an infrastructure challenge of enormous scale and cost. Russia has an estimated 150,000 buildings on permafrost, and the damage already attributable to permafrost thaw runs into billions of dollars. The infrastructure that crosses the permafrost landscape, pipelines, roads, railways, faces similar challenges at larger scale. The Power of Siberia pipeline, which carries natural gas across hundreds of kilometers of permafrost to the Chinese border, was engineered with current permafrost conditions in mind, but those conditions are changing on timescales shorter than the infrastructure's designed lifespan. Pipeline operators across Siberia have documented increasing rates of permafrost-related ground movement affecting pipeline alignment, requiring monitoring and intervention at accelerating frequency. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which touches the edges of the permafrost zone, has experienced permafrost-related maintenance issues for decades, and the expansion of the affected zone is a planning concern for railway engineers. The roads that serve Yakutia's remote communities, already challenging in their current state, are becoming less predictable as the seasonal cycle of freezing and thawing shifts. The ice roads that serve as winter lifelines for communities without year-round road connections are becoming shorter and less reliable. The season during which river ice is thick enough to bear vehicle traffic is contracting at both ends, forming later in autumn and breaking up earlier in spring. For communities that depend on the winter road season to receive bulk supplies, fuel, food, building materials, a shorter ice road season means smaller supply windows and higher costs for everything that must be air freighted as an alternative. Some communities that were reliably accessible by ice road for 5 or 6 months per year are now accessible for 4 or 3, and the trajectory suggests continued contraction. The spring breakup of the Lena River, already a dramatic annual event, is occurring earlier and producing flood events that are in some years more severe than historical patterns would predict. As warmer temperatures accelerate snowmelt and ice breakup simultaneously, the ecological consequences of permafrost thaw extend far beyond the built environment into the living landscape. As the permafrost thaws, it releases organic material that has been frozen for thousands or tens of thousands of years, plant matter, animal remains, ancient soil carbon, into a warming, biologically active environment where microbes begin breaking it down. This decomposition releases carbon dioxide and methane, both greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. Methane is particularly concerning because it is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over short timescales, and because the Arctic permafrost is estimated to contain approximately twice as much carbon as is currently present in the entire atmosphere. The release of even a fraction of this carbon through permafrost thaw could significantly accelerate global warming, creating a feedback loop. Warming thaws permafrost, permafrost releases greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause more warming, that climate scientists have been warning about for decades and are now beginning to observe in the measured data. The craters of Yakutia are among the more dramatic visual evidence of what permafrost thaw looks like at its most extreme. Since around 2014, a series of large, roughly circular craters have appeared in the Yamal and Yakutian tundra, holes in the ground tens of meters across and deep, apparently formed by the explosive release of methane gas that had accumulated in pockets beneath the permafrost as the frozen ground thawed from above. The craters formed suddenly, in some cases visibly. Witnesses described hearing explosions and seeing material ejected from the ground. The phenomenon, essentially unknown before the current warming period, has attracted considerable scientific attention and some public alarm, and researchers are working to understand both the mechanism and the frequency of these events. Historians and climate scientists still argue about whether these craters represent a genuinely new phenomenon or simply a newly visible one, but the consensus is that their frequency is increasing with permafrost temperatures. The forests of Yakutia, the vast Siberian taiga, one of the largest forest ecosystems on Earth, are responding to warming in complex and not entirely predictable ways. Warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons are, in some areas, allowing trees to grow faster and the forest to expand northward into tundra that was previously too cold to support it. This might sound like good news for forest cover, but the picture is complicated by the increasing frequency and severity of forest fires, which have become a major seasonal phenomenon across Siberia in recent years. Yakutia experienced catastrophic fire seasons in 2019 and 2021, with millions of hectares burning and smoke visible from satellite imagery across enormous distances. Warmer, drier summers create fire conditions that the taiga, adapted to a cooler, moister climate, is not well equipped to resist, and the fires themselves release enormous quantities of stored carbon, some of it from the organic soil layers above the permafrost, some from the trees themselves. The people of Yakutia are experiencing these changes not as abstract statistics but as alterations to the landscape they have known their entire lives. Hunters and herders report that the terrain they travel has changed. Routes that were reliable winter travel paths across frozen ground are now uncertain. Areas that were reliable summer hunting grounds are waterlogged from thermokarst formation. The behavior and distribution of game animals has shifted. The reindeer herders of the northern tundra face particular challenges from changing snow conditions. Warming winters produce more frequent freeze-thaw cycles that create ice layers within the snowpack, and reindeer cannot paw through hard ice to reach the grass beneath. When ice layers form across large areas, herds can face starvation in what should be their winter pasture, and the herders must move them, sometimes very long distances, sometimes with significant animal losses, to find accessible grazing. The Saka cultural relationship with the landscape, the spiritual framework in which specific places, specific rivers, specific mountains have significance and identity, is being disrupted by changes that alter the physical character of those places. A river that has shifted its course due to bank erosion accelerated by permafrost thaw is not the same river in the cosmological sense as it was before the shift. A hillside that has slumped into a thermokarst lake is not the hunting ground it was. The elders who carry the deep geographical knowledge of the Saka tradition, the knowledge of where to find game, where the ice is safe, where the good fishing is in different seasons, find that their knowledge, accumulated over lifetimes, is becoming less reliable as the landscape it describes changes around them. This is not merely practical loss but cultural loss, the erosion of a knowledge system that took centuries to build, by a process that is happening faster than the system can adapt. The young people of Yakutia navigate this changing landscape with a complexity that reflects their position between worlds. Many are educated, connected to global culture through the internet. Yakutsk has reliable broadband, smartphones are universal, social media is as present here as anywhere, and aware of the global context of what is happening to their home. Some feel a strong connection to Saka identity and tradition and are engaged in cultural revival and preservation. Others have left for Yakutsk, for Moscow, for other opportunities, drawn by the same forces that pull young people away from remote places everywhere. The population of small communities like Oymyakon has been declining for decades, a trend that predates climate change but that the changing environment may accelerate as livelihoods based on traditional land use become more precarious. And yet there is something deeply persistent about the relationship between the people of Yakutia and the cold that made them. The Isiaq festival continues to draw hundreds of thousands of participants each June, celebrating the return of warmth with a fervor that speaks to how deeply the rhythm of cold and recovery is embedded in Saka cultural identity. The Yakut language is being taught in schools and used in media and government in ways that represent a genuine, if contested, cultural revival. The films of the Yakutian cinema movement continue to tell stories rooted in this landscape, bringing the cold and its meanings to international audiences. A people built by the cold are finding ways to carry what the cold gave them into a world where the cold is changing. The future of the frozen world is uncertain in ways that are genuinely unprecedented. The permafrost that has been the foundation, literally, of Yakutian civilization for centuries is entering a period of instability whose endpoint nobody can precisely calculate. The ecosystems that supported human life here for millennia are reorganizing around new temperature regimes. The infrastructure built on frozen assumptions is cracking under warmer realities. And the people who live inside all of this are doing what people have always done in Yakutia, adapting, problem-solving, drawing on accumulated knowledge and community solidarity and the particular resilience that comes from having always lived somewhere that required resilience as a baseline condition. The cold shaped everything here, the bodies, the minds, the culture, the economy, the very buildings and roads. And now the cold is retreating, unevenly and incompletely but unmistakably, and what it leaves behind as it goes is a landscape in transition, a people in negotiation with change, and a set of questions about what endures when the defining condition of a place begins to shift. Those questions don't have answers yet. They are being lived, right now, by the people of the Saka Republic, in a landscape that still reaches -40 on an ordinary January night, that still freezes breath into falling crystals, that still demands from everyone who lives in it the full measure of attention and adaptation and respect. The cold has not finished with Yakutia. It has simply, for the first time in human memory, begun to negotiate. And now, as the story of Yakutia settles around you like the frost settling on those ancient larches, it is time to let the cold recede a little, to pull the warmth of the room closer around you, and to let your breathing slow. You have traveled a long way tonight, across frozen rivers and into permafrost cellars, through the kitchens of people who eat their fish frozen and their history raw, past the footprints of mammoths and the fires of shamans and the quiet endurance of a people who looked at the coldest place on earth and decided to call it home. You have stood briefly in -71, and you have felt the cold not as an enemy but as something older and more complicated than that. A force that shapes everything it touches, that asks everything of those who live within it, and that gives back, in return, a clarity and a beauty and a depth of human achievement that warmer places rarely produce. Let the images soften now. The sharp edges of the ice, the hard lines of frozen trees, the bright geometry of frost on glass. Let them blur slightly at the edges. Let them become gentler versions of themselves. The Lena River, wide and frozen in silver under a sky full of stars, is carrying you slowly, and the current is quiet and the ice is thick and safe, and on the banks the birches stand in their white coats, perfectly still, breathing their faint whisper of frost into the air. The lights of a small settlement glow amber in the distance, warm windows against the blue dark, and inside those windows people are sitting by fires that have burned in this valley in one form or another for hundreds of years, and the warmth of those fires reaches you even here on the river, even in the dark, even across all the cold miles of this extraordinary frozen world. You are warm. You are safe. The cold outside is doing what it has always done, patient and ancient and thorough, and it will be there tomorrow, and the people who know it best will meet it tomorrow as they have always met it. Fully dressed, fully prepared, fully present in the only landscape they have ever needed. And you, having spent this night in their company, in their cold, in their remarkable persistent human warmth, can let your eyes close now, can let the story settle into the quiet place where good stories go, can let the sound of the frost and the river and the soft amber glow of those distant windows carry you gently, gently, into the deep and dreamless cold of a perfect winter sleep.